They are going, they are going. The Irish are going with a vengeance. The London Times screams with delight. Soon a Celt will be as rare on the banks of the Liffey as a red man on the banks of the Hudson. It was all for the advancement of civilization, the Times assured the world. Law has ridden through Ireland. It has taught with bayonets and interpreted with ruin. Townships leveled with the ground, straggling columns of exiles, workhouses multiplied and still crowded, expressed the determination of the legislature to rescue Ireland from its slovenly old barbarism and to plant there the institutions of this more civilized land.
The warm attachment of the Irish peasant to the locality where he was born and brought up will always make the best and most carefully conducted scheme of immigration a matter of painful sacrifice for the immigrant.
The failure of the potato crop in the 1840s broke that attachment. The first body of famine emigrants who left for Canada and the US tended to be the better off, people who had already been thinking about emigrating. And now, at the onset of hard times, that decision was made easier. In the April and May of 1846, we're told that the quayside here in Westport was thronged with comfortable farmers on the way to a new life. But after the second failure of the potato crop later that summer, there was sudden panic. Anyone who could scrape the fare together was trying to get to Quebec before ice closed the St. Lawrence. But many unsuitable ships were chartered, and the people were ill-prepared to face the journey, and they arrived penniless. And diseases began to appear. The era of the coffin ship had begun. 85,000 sailed from larger ports. Unestimated numbers from smaller ports like Ballina, Westport, Tralee and Killala. Navigation systems were imperfect. Sailing ships could all too easily be blown onto lee shores, and the first steamships were very prone to go on fire. People were afraid of the sea in those days and had good reason to be. The famine forced people to overcome that fear.
If you had less than 20 acres, your odds on being wiped out as a family, as a farm, as a unit were extremely high. Because basically what happened was that these people depended on potatoes as their almost total source of food. The potato crop fails. They have to get food elsewhere. If you were working for a farmer as a cottier, you were paid by the plot of land where you grew your potatoes. The potato crop fails, you're not going to stay working for a farmer to pay off the rotting potatoes. So you left and you went to work in the public works to earn money. As a result, you lost your house, you lost your land. He wouldn't hire you the following season because you left him in the lurch at the time. And you ended up then with nowhere to live, no means of support. You ended up in the workhouse, often dead, perhaps emigrating, family perhaps broken up, father going to America, abandoned children in the workhouse, all kinds of really horrible scenarios.
Teenagers in Ireland deliberately stole in hope of being transported as convicts to Australia. A youth named Owen Eady, when asked in court if he knew the meaning of transportation, said,
"Even if I had chains on my legs, I would still have something to eat."
2.5 million people left Ireland between 1845 and 55. That would never have been possible if the process had to be learned from scratch. People had been leaving since the 20s and 30s. The agents were installed and the routes worked out. It was common for an emigrant ship to advertise they would sail on a day on which they had no intention of leaving. The captain would thereby ensure of picking up as many passengers as he could pack into the vessel. Now, of course, this meant that the majority of passengers had to find accommodation near the port for up to a week, and they didn't have much money, so they had to find cheap lodgings, often run by unscrupulous landlords who crammed their damp and filthy rooms to capacity. It was from lice-ridden bedding in these boarding houses that many were to catch the dreaded typhus, from which they were later to die on their journey across the Atlantic.
At daybreak, we were roused by the clanking of the capstan as the anchor was weighed. There was light from the northeast, sails were spread, and we slowly beat out of the bay and took a long slant into the channel, dropping our pilot as we passed Kingstown. Stores were broached and biscuit for 3 days served. They were coarse and somewhat mouldy, yet the government office was supposed to have examined and passed them as up to the requirements of the Emigration Act. April 17. How shamefully the ship was overcrowded was now to be seen and fully realised. There were not berths for 2/3 of the passengers, and by common consent they were given up to the aged, to the women and the children. The others slept on chests and bundles, and many could find no other resting place on the floor, which was so occupied that there was no room to walk about. I ascertained accidentally that the mate served out rations for 530 today. He counts 2 children as one, so that there are over 600 souls on board a ship, which should not legally have 400, for the Emigrant Act specifies 10 square feet of deck to a passenger.
In the 1840s, a ticket for a man, his wife and 4 small children across the Atlantic was £6. For his money he got this living space, a cabin berth 4 foot by 6, where the whole family had to live and sleep for the entire journey across the Atlantic. Of course there was no toilet, just a bucket, which was emptied every night, unless of course it had toppled over by the heaving ship. The ticket also entitled each passenger to £1 of food and 3 quarts of water. But they were lucky if they got it. The captain and crew often would cheat the passengers by skimping on the rations.
The first time I went below, I was reminded of a cavern, long and narrow and low ceiling. Today it was a place for the damned. 3 blinking oil lanterns cast light enough to show the outlines of forms that lay groaning on the floor, and give glimpses of white, stony faces lying in the berths, a double tier of which surrounded the sides of the ship. A poignant wail of misery came through an atmosphere of such deadly odour that, for the first time, I felt sick and had to beat a hasty retreat up the narrow ladder. April 26. There is now not a shadow of a doubt that typhus fever is on board. Since we left port, no attempt has been made to clear the steerage, which is filthy beyond description. When I speak to the men to join in and shovel up the worst of the dirt, they despondently ask me, what's the use? The despondency engendered of hunger and disease is upon them, and they will not exert themselves. The steward is the only one of the ship's company who goes down the hatch steps, and it would be better if he did not, for his errand is to sell the drink for which so many are parting with the sixpences they should keep for their landing in a strange country. April 29. The breaking out of the fever has produced, even among us hardened to misfortune, something like a panic. The crew are in mortal terror of the infection and will not allow passengers to go on the forecastle, as was their wont. The ship being sent to sea purposely short-handed, the owner relying on saving something by getting the emigrants to help, a few of our lads who had been given bunks in the forecastle and allowed sailors' rations have been warned if they go down to the hatchways to see their people, they need not return. April 30. The fever spreads, and to the other horrors of the steerage is added the cries of those in delirium. While I was coming from the galley this afternoon with a pan of stirabout for some sick children, a man suddenly sprang upward from the hatchway, rushed to the bulwark, his white hair streaming in the wind, and without a moment's hesitation leaped into the seething waters. He disappeared beneath him at once. His daughter soon came hurrying up the ladder to look for him. She said he had escaped from his bunk during her momentary absence, that he was mad with fever. When I told her, gently as I could, that she would never see him again, she could not believe me, thinking he was hiding. Oh, the piercing cry that came from her lips when she learned where he had gone. Aileen led her away, dumb from the sudden stroke, yet without a tear. May 3rd. The drinking water has been growing daily worse, and now the smell of it is shocking. The barrels must have been filled from the Liffey near a sewer. Repugnant as it is to sight, smell and taste, it continues to be doled out in such meagre measure that the sick are continually crying for water, with not a drop to give them. The number now sick is appalling. The young of dysentery, the old of fever, the cause of both diseases starvation. Uncle's second boy died this afternoon of dysentery. Poor uncle. His lot is a sore one, yet he never complained. May 5th. Weather bitterly cold. No child played on deck today. Passed large fields of ice requiring great skill in handling the ship to avoid them. Captain remained on deck all day. While I have no respect for him as a man, he is an excellent sailor. Passed 2 ships caught on the ice. May 9th. Uncle's oldest son dies of a fever soon after daylight. The blow is a crushing one, but I have yet to hear the first murmur from Uncle. His submission to the divine will is most touching. The body, along with 2 more, we dropped overboard when the sailors were at dinner. Though near the end of our voyage, the little tyrant on the poop has given no order to increase the supply of water or biscuit. I did not think the stench of the hold could become worse, but the heat we had a day ago has intensified it.
Gerald Keegan and his wife died of fever at the quarantine station of Groseal in Canada. His uncle also died at Groseal, having buried at sea his wife and 2 sons. It was reckoned that over the famine years, about 17,000 emigrants died during the crossing. Thousands more died soon after disembarking. An American emigration official wrote,
"If crosses and tombs could be erected on the water, the whole route of the emigrant vessels from Europe to America would long since have assumed the appearance of a crowded cemetery."
5,000 people are estimated to be buried in this mass grave, the body of Gerald Keegan and his wife Aileen presumably among them. Much of the hardship of the Atlantic crossing arose from the fact that the emigrant ships were never built for passenger transport, but for the timber trade between Canada and Britain. When the timber was cleared out, people were put in as walk-on, walk-off ballast for the return trip. The problem about building and financing proper passenger ships to North America was that too few people were interested in coming back to Britain. Where the traffic on a passenger ship is one way only, the fares have to be high to pay for the return journey. Large-scale emigration was possible in the 19th century because British policy was to keep fares to Quebec at a low level. They hoped thereby to boost the English-speaking population in Canada as opposed to the French, as well as develop the enormous resources in the interests of the mother country. But it was difficult to keep this low fare policy and ensure the safety and health of the passengers. Safety legislation was passed and then withdrawn because it interfered with the primary aim, which was to keep the fares low. Conditions in British ships were therefore much worse than in others, particularly the Americans. In 1827, a parliamentary commission asserted that Britain faced a choice.
Whether the Irish were to be enabled to emigrate to Canada by fares being kept down, or whether to deluge Great Britain with poverty and wretchedness.
It was easy to get to Britain. Coal ships returning to Wales brought numbers as ballast for free from Cork and Waterford.
In the past 48 hours, more than 3,000 paupers have landed in Liverpool. 240 from Cork, 701 from Sligo, 692 from Drogheda, 272 from Newry, and 911 from Dublin.
There was an irresistible attraction in going to England. The starving were given food. People knew that in England, if not in Ireland, they would not be allowed to die of hunger. Bath reported that the town was swamped by new armies of destitute Irish coming through from Wales. Any hope that the misery of the destitute might evoke compassion was destroyed by fear of fever. None dared give them shelter, and people set their dogs on them.
It is far better not to mention names, but certain landlords were pressing their tenants very hard. In one case, notices to appear in court had been served on 1,400 tenants who had not paid their rent, of whom 900 fled. An application of this kind is known throughout a barony as soon as it takes place, and when known, the cottier and his family without hesitation put everything portable on their back and make their way towards Dublin or some other seaport, determined to reach England, where they all understand they will not be allowed to starve.
Between January and June 1847, 300,000 paupers landed in Liverpool, more than the resident population of 250,000. Several government-assisted emigration schemes were tried.
4,000 Irish women were given free transport to Australia, the former penal settlement being short of women.
In the spring of 1847, the idea of a massive emigration scheme for the Irish was floated. By its terms, 1.5 million Irish Catholics were to be transferred to Canada in 3 years, setting up an Irish Catholic colony.
In sober earnestness, gentlemen, why send your circular to a Catholic bishop? Why have the barefaced impudence to ask me to consent to the expatriation of millions of my co-religionists and fellow countrymen? You, the hereditary oppressors of my race and my religion, you who reduced one of the noblest peoples under heaven to live in the most fertile island on earth, on the worst species of a miserable potato, you who have made the most beautiful island under the sun a land of skulls or of ghastly spectres. You are anxious, I presume, to get a Catholic bishop to abet your wholesale systems of extermination, to head in pontificals the convoy of your exiles, and thereby give the sanction of religion to your atrocious scheme. You never, gentlemen, laboured under a more egregious mistake.
Despite Bishop McGinn's strong words, the clergy as a whole were ambivalent about emigration. J.K.L., Bishop of Kildare and Loughlin, when asked was he for emigration, said, "I am and I am not." Priests often helped people to emigrate, financially and otherwise. It seemed the only possible way to help alleviate the appalling human suffering all around them. Perhaps they also felt that the emigrants helped strengthen the church abroad. But they can't have been too happy about losing significant numbers of their parishioners, the best and most active young blood in the parish.
Emigration schemes by landlords were frugal, if by and large humane, but several bad examples came to public notice and led to much resentment and outcry. The cost of emigrating a pauper was about half the cost of maintaining him in the workhouse for a year, and once the ship sailed, the problem disappeared. 2,000 people in all were emigrated from the Irish estates of Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary. One of the ships arrived at St. John, New Brunswick on the 2nd of November with 240 emigrants. The surgeon at quarantine said that 99% were helpless and must become a public charge immediately.
We deeply regret that one of Her Majesty's ministers should have exposed such a numerous and distressed portion of his tenantry to the severity and privations of a New Brunswick winter, unprovided with the common means of support, with broken down constitutions and almost in a state of nudity.
Most nationalists from O'Connell to Parnell were strongly opposed to emigration, substituting cattle for Christians. They wanted the problems tackled which were causing it: land tenure and absence of capital. In the end, the government didn't accept the idea of mass emigration on grounds of cost. But the people made their own decision and paid for it themselves. The first to go sent back information and money to the next.
I wish to heaven all our countrymen were here. The laborer can earn as much in one day as will support him for a week. The richest land in the world may be purchased here or in Wisconsin for $1.25 an acre, equal to 5 3/4. Pure alluvial soil over 30 feet deep. If I could show them the splendid prairie I'm looking on, extending in wild, luxuriant verdure far as the eye can reach, virgin soil that will stand the wear and tear of ages without requiring a shovelful of manure, how different would their situation be from what it is? How gladly they would fly with their families.
Apart from money, the American letter would offer practical details of employment options, wage rates, transport costs, diet, and a network of Irish contacts. Nearly £1 million a year was sent privately from the States to relatives and friends in Ireland in the years following the famine. Some of the money in the American letters was used to pay rent, shop debts, and to purchase farms, but 2/5 of the remittances came in the form of prepaid passage tickets.
The two things to note about the Irish are, first of all, the sheer numbers that Ireland sends, and secondly, the longevity of the Irish emigrant experience. In terms of numbers, you're talking about 1800 to 1920, probably 9 million at least. We're not very clear on the numbers going to Britain because they weren't counted, but you're talking about 9 million people or thereabouts. In other words, more people than ever lived in Ireland at any one time. And you're talking about a level that is grossly out of proportion with any other country in Europe. I mean, before the famine, Ireland is sending 10 times its proportion of the European population to America in emigrants. And over the whole 19th century, the Irish contribution is a disproportionate one. And the other thing to bear in mind is that the Irish are among the leading emigrants to North America in, say, 1820s, 1830s. They're also among the leading immigrants. They're not exactly the tops, but they're still very important in 1900. They're still quite important in the 1920s. A lot of other societies have come and gone. The English immigration is very insignificant by this stage. The Scandinavians sent immigrants for about a 20 to 30 year period, but then that drifts away, that dies off. The Irish are there 1800. In truth, they're there in the 1980s as well, and that's perhaps one of the most frightening aspects of the whole process.
Emigration became a way of life for many people, in the sense that they knew in childhood that they would be emigrating. Emigration developed its own ritual in the American wake. In the poorer parts of Ireland, raising children became an insurance scheme. Elderly parents could look forward to being supported by the dollars earned by their children in America. C.B. McKenna wrote in The Depopulation of Ireland,
"Only too aptly do we recall the poet's lament for the bold peasantry, their country's pride, which once destroyed can never be supplied. The very flower of our race is being swept away. It is the young and the strong who go, those who might be a profit instead of a loss to their country. Emigration takes the best. Well, it has been described as an inverted form of natural selection which, as far as Ireland is concerned, results in the survival of the unfittest."
Well, you see it stated that those that left were obviously the nonconformists, the adventurers, and those that couldn't put up with the horrors and the conformities of Irish society. And when I'm teaching an audience here, I always say, well, that means that we're the rejects that were left behind. But in the States, you can obviously, when I taught class in the States, I said the reverse. But the reality doesn't support that case, in fact, because those that left were poor and much poorer than the average. They had much less education than the average, and they are more illiterate than the average, because you can see it if you compare illiteracy statistics for, say, County Carlow in the 1850s, and you've got the illiterates aged under 25, 15 to 25, and then you look at the illiteracy level for the same cohort 10 years later, you find the illiteracy level has dropped, and they weren't all going to evening school. It's quite obvious that a disproportionate number of the illiterates have actually gone. Now, the contrary case to that is, of course, the women, because the women, certainly by the turn of the century, the women that leave seem to be slightly better educated than the average, and if there was a gene pool loss, it's probably more among the females than among the males, strangely enough. But for the men, the evidence is really, if the family had money, there's a much higher chance that they were able to stay in Ireland. They were able to stay in school, they could become policemen, they could get clerical jobs, they could be apprenticed. There's a range of options that they could have. It's the families without money, and it's the families without the resources for education and for anything like that. The unskilled, they're the people who really left the country in large numbers.
In the beginning, the conditions abroad were poor for the poor Irish. But the future was always bright for those who were willing to work, and most of them were.
If this exodus goes on, as it is likely to go on, the United States will become very Irish. So, an island there will still be, but on a colossal scale and in a new world. We shall only have pushed the Celt westwards. Then, no longer cooped up between the Liffey and the Shannon, he will spread from New York to San Francisco and keep up the ancient feud at an unforeseen advantage. We must gird our loins to encounter the nemesis of 7 centuries of misgovernment. To the end of time, 100 million spread over the largest habitable area in the world and confronting us everywhere by sea and land will remember that their forefathers paid tithe to the Protestant clergy, rent to absentee landlords, and a forced obedience to the laws which these had made.